Welcome back to the Matter of Facts podcast on the Prepper Broadcasting Network. We talk prepping, guns, and politics every week on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify. Go check out our content at mwfpodcast.com on Facebook or Instagram. You can support us via Patreon or by checking out our affiliate partners. I'm your host, Phil Rabalais, and my co-host, Andrew Bobo, is on the other side of the mic, and here's your show. So 2 weeks in a row now, Andrew's been a slacker. And I'm not going to apologize for him. I'm just going to browbeat him and shame him into joining me next week. But in the meantime, I grabbed Nick.
Shame is a powerful motivator.
Shame can be a powerful motivator. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I thought we'd have an interesting conversation about militias and kind of like what your experience has been with them and the backstory on what a militia actually is, because I find that very instructional. Before we get started, do you want me to out your last name or you just want to be Nick?
Oh, it's no problem. I'm public on our Facebook group. I've been associated with the militias in the past, live on Facebook. No worries about it.
Yep, I just have to ask out of, genuine common courtesy and manners.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
But yeah, I mean, the militia is kind of as a concept, the militia is something that predates the United States of America. It's not like we invented the idea. I mean, there's always been some kind of a paramilitary force utilized for protecting the homes within a given area. I mean, that's something that honestly dates back to even tribal times when you had the menfolk would grab their swords and their clubs and run off to go fight the other side to protect everybody that was in the rear of the gear. Like, that's not a new concept.
Yeah,
I think
If anything, modern standing militaries are the exception rather than the norm, if we're talking anthropological history.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going back to like very, very early man, I mean, you could probably trace that back to probably the Romans. I mean, that's probably one of the earlier really formalized militaries. And even then, they conscripted a lot of their soldiers. Mm-hmm. I think probably the most recent advent would probably be an all-volunteer force.
Yes.
Like that's a distinctly mid-20th century, or not even mid, that's late 20th century idea, is that we shouldn't snatch people out of their homes and say, here's a rifle, go to war.
Yeah, an all-volunteer force is largely a modern creation, you're correct. There were some militaries that were volunteers for the most part in the past. Some of the Greek city-states, if you wanted to vote, I believe Athens, to be a voting citizen, you had to do time in the hoplites. I believe. I don't know what the name of their military was, but the infantry were some kind of hoplites. Yeah, the signature's right. The Legion was somewhat voluntary, at least on the officer corps level.
Yeah.
But a lot of, especially in the later Roman Empire, a lot of those were made up by mercenary conscripts. Usually from conquered peoples outside of Rome itself, because Rome simply could not supply enough upper crust men, which is what they preferred for the legions.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want your underfed, your poor, your skinny, your weak fighting your military at the tip of the spear. Like,
well, you also don't want your underclass knowing how to fight either.
Yeah. I wasn't quite going there yet, but yeah, you're right. I mean, that's actually been one of the interesting things about like coming from the military community, is that I keep hearing all this scattered talk from various corners of like our society about all these scary men that know all this, have all this scary paramilitary training. And I just think to myself, I'm like, you do understand that like because of global war on terror, because of GWAT, you have an enormous cadre of former military from all walks of life, and even the most like pog, non-grunt cook or truck driver has at least a baseline understanding of how to shoot, how to move, how to communicate, has some basic training and tactics. And because of the military turnover rate we've had in the last 20 years, most of them are civilians now.
That's very true.
And even the ones that aren't quote unquote
right about the French Foreign Legion too.
True. All mercenary, all volunteer force mercenary, but still.
Right. Yeah. You're right. Even nowadays, and this is a lesson I think we learned to great cost in World War II, was a lot of like back then the line cooks and stuff like that. The the truck drivers, were not as well trained. We're not trained up to a basic infantry standard. And a lot of times when there was a breakout, most of those people died. They did. That's just how it was for most of history. And a lot of times those lessons were ignored. But the modern U.S. Army and most first world nations nowadays, everyone goes through basic training. Yeah, they might not be a door kicker, but they go through basic training. And that is by and far better than a large amount of the, I would say, ignorant civilian populace, like people that don't, like us, go out and seek training.
Yeah, and even in like tailing into that discussion, like I'm one of those people that, despite being a vet, I get very critical of people that say, oh, I was in the military, therefore I know ABC XYZ, unless their military resume really stipulates that. Because right. I tend to be much more impressed by just your common everyday jack civilian who goes out and seeks that training and spends the time and their own money and their own effort to learn those skills. Because in my experience, they're better at it. I mean, like, I went out shooting with a military buddy years and years ago, and like, this is a guy that I deployed to Iraq with. We've known each other for years. Kind of fell out of touch over the last few years. He moved away, and our lives kind of went different directions, but we still keep in touch. And I'd shot, I think, probably one of the best 3-4 shot groups I'd ever shot in my life. I had a 4 rounds touching at 100 yards out of a 3-way bolt action, because I'd spent a lot of time tuning up that load, doing load development. And I finally found the recipe that rifle likes. And he looked at that and he said, why the hell couldn't you shoot that good when we were enlisted together? And I told him, because I didn't give a shit.
Well, it's
the truth. At the time, I was a helicopter mechanic. Like, I knew how to handle an AR-15 or an M16, but it was not a priority to me, because my priority was not killing the poor SOBs on the helicopter. So that's where I spent all my time and effort learning. But since I don't fix helicopters anymore, I have time for other things.
Right. And, that's a very common sentiment. Passion trumps a paycheck. Not my thing. Got that quote from an older guy. Passion trumps a paycheck. If somebody lives and breathes long range shooting, they will be better than the people that don't. Yes, you can train a damn fine sniper with a good paycheck. Very excellent. Would not want one of them hunting me. Fair enough. But there's an old retired guy that I used to work with who has an 800-yard rifle range in his backyard. And you know what he does every morning? He sends about 20 rounds downrange. And those 20 rounds impact a 1-inch disc. That's his goal for the day, is to have every round hit within a 1-inch circle at 800 yards. Now, he doesn't, not to say he always does it, not to say he does it with every 20 rounds, but that's his personal goal with his homemade rifle. He's a tool and die maker too. And he took a Remington 700, tuned and trued the action, tuned and trued the barrel, and spent the last 15 years dedicating himself to ultra precision accuracy. Can't tell you what size his groups normally are. He doesn't usually show that stuff off. But his second hobby is competing in 1,000-yard matches with Civil Warrior rifled muskets and Sharps Buffalo rifles. 1,000-yard matches with a Sharps Buffalo rifle. Granted, their targets are bigger. It's a 3-foot bullseye at 1,000 yards with a black powder cartridge throwing like a 12-foot parabolic.
He and our buddy Eddie would probably have a rolling conversation for hours.
Him and Eddie would have a good time. Eddie would love his gun vault. It is a vault bigger than the office I'm in right now.
Eddie would probably have to be escorted off of his property by police because he'd refuse to leave. Like, lock me in here, leave snacks, I'll be fine.
Paul won't kick you out either. He's the best. He's fantastic. He's a really good guy. He worked with me for about 10 years. He's a really good guy. He does a lot of gunsmithing as a part-time hobby now. And it's guys like him that, speaking of the militias, It's guys like him back in the day that were equipping the militias, that were training the militias. All of us are probably in violation. Thankfully, it's been rescinded, the 1972 Militia Act, because I do not own a musket and 40 rounds of ammunition for it. I don't. Why would I? I have better things. But up until, I believe it was 1903 changed that, we would have all technically been out of compliance with the Militia Act, and that's a felony.
So since you've dovetailed us into that so gracefully, let's start that conversation, because just as an aside, for anybody that has ever found themselves on social media or in person arguing with somebody about what the word militia means in the Second Amendment, I love to bring up the Militia Act, because it really stabs a ton of holes in every argument you're going to hear about how the militia only applies to the National Guard and the military. People can argue that, well, now we have a standing army and we shouldn't need that, but that's irrelevant. I'm an originalist when it comes to the Constitution. I believe that what was written is valid until it's repealed, and if you repeal it, then God be with you, suffer the consequences of angering the people that didn't want it repealed. But until it's repealed or it's superseded by another amendment, I think we ought to just honor that. But call me an idealist. Yeah. So the Militia Act dates back to 1792. That was the original Militia Act, and the root cause of this was that, let's see, I'm actually reading this on the air screen because I can't memorize any of this crap. But basically, the president had the president invoked the authority to call all local militias together to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion. But that authority only lasted 2 years. After that was done, the Militia Act was legislated to try to give the president, whatever president it was going to be, some authority to call the militias to action. Because, we had this really weird arrangement when the country was first founded where every state really ran like its own independent nation, and we just joined hands when we needed to because it was in all of our best interest. And that meant we didn't have a standing army because, call it what it is, our founding fathers were actually pretty suspicious of standing armies. And
shocker.
Shocker. Considering that, they just had to freaking kick redcoats out of our country, I can understand where they would be a little leery of vesting the power of a standing army and the monopoly on violence that would inevitably lead to in the hands of a federal government. Again, idealistic, I know.
Mm-hmm.
But that was the original intent, was to give the president some kind of authority to call the governors and say, I need your guys. We got some stuff to deal with. And I find there's lots of stuff in the Militia Acts I'm not going to read because we don't have that kind of time. But there is one specific section I love to point out to people. And it is this little excerpt, which I don't think is word for word because I had to shave down a little bit to make it fit into the block. But militia members were required to equip themselves with a musket, a bayonet, and a belt, 2 spare flints, a box able to contain not less than 24 suitable cartridges, and a knapsack. So these militia members were, as Nick said, required under penalty of felony. They were required to equip themselves. They were required to provide their own arm and their own field gear. So in modern times, this would be like the federal government passing a law that would say, if you are between this age and this age, you shall have an AR pattern rifle and 10 mags and body armor and all the gear you need to go out hunting redcoats, discussion over. And if you don't like all that, you go to prison. That is, yes, this is an 18th century law, but this was only ratified a handful of years after the Second Amendment itself was ratified. So
it absolutely was. This occurred short and was re-ratified and edited shortly after the Whiskey Rebellion. So this was put into place after citizens had rebelled using these arms, which just goes to prove that they believed that it was important enough that even after we were proved to be rebellious, that we had to keep these rights and responsibilities.
Well, call it what it is. And this is the conversation I've had with people from overseas who fundamentally, and I can't blame them for this, but they fundamentally don't understand American culture, which I can understand because I've been in parts of the world where I didn't understand their culture because, ethnocentrism is a thing and it's hard to see somebody else's culture through their own lens. It's just called that a human failing. but they didn't understand wide aspects of our culture, including the Second Amendment, the civilian right to keep and bear arms, and so on and so forth. And I try to explain to everybody, I'm like, you have to start with the fact that our country was literally born out of us shifting from being loyal subjects of the King of England to being so aggravated with how we were being treated by our king that we would rather die in the streets than live that way any longer. So we rebelled. This is a country born out of rebellion, born out of unrest. And like, we're not unique in that fact. There are several countries around the world that are born out of this idea of like, we have to throw off the chains of tyranny and stand up. Poland is a great example of that, among others. Czechoslovakia being another one. And what do those countries have in common with us? Poland and Czechoslovakia are extremely averse to allowing their own government or any other government to become tyrannical because they've already been there and done that and had to throw that off.
And there's a generational paranoia with regard to government power. And it is so much deeper. In at very least Poland, I have a Polish coworker who immigrated as a teen. That man makes your fear of big government pale. That you would have to drag him kicking and screaming into any kind of larger government. In fact, he left Poland specifically because, or his parents left Poland specifically because the government here had less authority. That's why they came here. It wasn't for economic prosperity. His parents were doing fine there, at least so he tells it. I have to believe him. It was because here the government had less say in what you did, even after they'd thrown off communism. Now, granted, coming out of communism, anything's great.
Oh, yeah.
You know, anything's an improvement. But this guy came over here at 15, served in the U.S. Army, got his citizenship. Fantastic guy. Excellent guy to work with. But man, you can't get him to trust the local park district. And probably rightly so.
I mean, knowing how government bureaucracies work, I think that sounds like a fair baseline to start from.
I think it really is.
But the one other group we haven't talked about that bears on this is Cubans. People that fled Castro are some of the staunchest small government screw communist people I've ever met, and they are some of the most vocal. Like there is an ethnic group that I'd like to say as a whole, even though I'm sure there's like a handful out there that disprove the rule, but I've never met or heard from any of them. But everyone I've ever met who is even like a quarter Cuban, who has family that escaped Castro,
or have yet to escape,
and are still stuck there, they are extremely spring-loaded to the idea of, we want minimum government, we want maximum freedom, because they've seen the inverse of that.
You know, fortunately, in a country with minimal government, if you want to seek out a jurisdiction with more government, or if you want to give up more control to your locality, you can. You're well and free to do that. You can ask the government for every type of permission you want. And they can, whether they have a law or not, they can, if you ask them, they can tell you yes or no. A judge can tell you yes or no for all kinds of things that are not law. But you don't have that option in the inverse. And that's really the sticking point. You know, it's the biggest difference between capitalist economies, mixed economies, and socialist economies. In a capitalist economy, if you want to start a socialist commune, be my guest. Go forth and prosper. In a socialist country, if you want to start a capitalist commune, oh no.
Gulag.
To the gulag with you.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of the hilarious part to me is like, you know, way above and beyond a philosophical, you leave the rest of us alone. Like, there's nothing even illegal about implementing voluntary socialism on a small scale.
Oh no,
there's
in
nothing.
Fact, voluntary socialism is the baseline family unit.
Pretty much, because I have a dependent in that other room that
you do.
this is a three-way socialist economy because I have a freeloader
Exactly.
who's living off of my labor and providing nothing of value yet.
From those, what is it?
My wife is going to hear this. I am totally joking. I'm just making a joke.
What is it? From each according to his ability, to each according to their need, is the perfect summation of the family unit. The children have no ability to provide for themselves at a young age. And yeah, I started working pretty young. I started working at 13. So yes, I could have contributed to the family earlier. Did I? No. My parents didn't require it. They probably could have. And maybe it would have been wise for them to do so. It might have taught me some important financial lessons. But I learned them eventually anyway. But I think that's where when you come to big government, where some people get drawn into that, drawn into the, oh, we need a standing army for this and that, and oh, we need a government to take care of this and that, because as children, all they ever knew was big government, that is their parents, that provide and protect them in every circumstance.
Well, that, and I mean, I can see a certain appeal to trusting your supposed betters. It absolves you of
Sure.
the responsibility of making really horrible life decisions because you can always go back to mommy and daddy, government,
Yeah.
and say, well, I did what you said and it blew up my face. Dig me out of this hole, and reasonably
Exactly.
expect them to.
Just like
But
at work, we all, if there's a questionable judgment call to be made, who do we all go to? The next
boss,
person above us, and we get that in a written email. Because if it blows up, which hey, everybody makes a bad call now and then, wasn't my call.
yeah, and I subscribe to a slightly different version of that, which is always whoever's face it's going to blow up in gets to make the call. Because like
That's
there
fair.
there've been times when I've been in that position in a variety of jobs, and I've pushed back against my boss and said, "Look, if this goes bad, I'm the one that's going to have to fix it. So I should be the one to make the call." That's not always a popular sentiment when you're telling your superior, "Back off, get out of my way." But I'm usually eloquent enough to like, explain that in a way that doesn't sound like buzz off, get out of my face. It's more of a
Right.
look, if this blows up, you're not going to be the one that has to fix it. I am. So if I have to
Right.
fix it, let me screw it up at least. Like
At
let
least
me
then you have full knowledge of how the screw up occurred, and you can attempt to fix it.
yeah.
You know, Eh,
But conversely, if my boss is the one that's going to have to go talk to upper management about it, I'm like, look, I will make a judgment call, but I'm giving you an opportunity to guide me in this.
I'm giving you the veto privilege.
Yes, yeah, I
And
am.
there are times when big government very necessary. I'm not a libertarian absolutist. I guess you could call me a small L libertarian. I'm not a huge believer in absolute freedom for everyone. There are clearly people that cannot make the right choice, and we clearly do need some safety nets. I get it. We clearly need a standing army because of how warfare is conducted nowadays. I understand and admit that. But to eliminate the militia in its entirety, now that's questionable. And Ukraine is the perfect example of this.
Yep.
Ukraine trusted big government, and let's be honest, the US is the big government in this situation. We promised them that they would never be invaded if they gave up their nuclear weapons. That is the same as the US government promising us that if we give up our AR-15s and everything else we've got, that they're going to be there to keep and protect us just in case everything goes wrong. Well, how's that working out in Ukraine? Granted, we're probably not going to be invaded by our neighbor to the north. Canada is a warm hat and a very friendly group of people. Probably not going to invade us. But that doesn't mean someone else won't ever.
Yeah. Well, to your summation about trusting the government to always protect us. Anybody here ever lived through a natural disaster and been waiting on FEMA to show up to rescue everybody? Y'all let me know how that works out because I was part of a friggin' government led, effort to rescue people after Hurricane Katrina, and I will say that for the people that were on the ground, we were doing our damnedest, but there were a lot of people that got hurt in the meantime because
And it's
that and
inevitable.
Yeah, I mean that's honestly like one of the reasons why this podcast even started, was just to try to get people thinking about, look, when things go bad, yes, the government, your governor, your state, your neighborhood, your city, your federal government, your whatever should be there to try to help. But in the meantime, you might want to have a couple extra bags of chips and a flat of water just in case. Because I don't know if I've told this story on this podcast, but after Hurricane Ida that hit us a couple years ago, my wife and I were sitting around listening to the radio the day after Ida. Because, power's out, trees
What
down
else is
everywhere.
time to do?
Yeah, I got a tree sitting in my front yard and two sitting on the house. We've got food and water. We're not going to die. We're okay. But like, it's a bad situation. We had nothing better to do than turn on the radio and try to get some kind of intelligence about how the rest of the area had been hit.
Mm-hmm.
And I literally heard a guy call into the local radio station down in New Orleans, and he was wanting to know when the grocery stores were going to reopen because he was out of food and he was hungry. The day after Hurricane Ida flattened 5 zip codes.
And Ida, now correct me if I'm wrong, you may have talked about this before. That was not forecasted to be as severe or hit your area, but it was forecasted to be in the area, right?
Oh, it was 110% going to hit. It was 110% going to hit Louisiana. There was no avoiding that.
Okay.
It was supposed to have gone further to the west.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, the short version of that horrible, sad story goes that if Hurricane Ida had gone where it was originally forecast to go, it would have been on the other side of Baton Rouge from me, and Ida had tropical storm winds.
Okay.
50,
But
60
still
mile an
enough
hour
that it
max.
could cause serious damage.
Honestly, based on the original track, I was kind of anticipating 1-2 days max we'd have been out of power. I mean,
But still,
like I said,
that's 1 or 2 days out of power. That's still serious damage. I mean, you're talking about thousands of lines, dozens to hundreds of transformers, probably several hundred repair crews at the very least, just for power alone.
yeah. Well,
You're basically talking about everything frozen or refrigerated in grocery stores being thrown away, realistically.
Yeah. Suffice to say, if we would have known it was going to veer hard right at the last second,
Right.
I don't think we'd have stuck around for it.
Oh, for sure. Well, given perfect hindsight, we all would make better choices, right?
For the most part.
But we can only make the choices with the knowledge we have at the time.
Yeah. And, Andrew had to talk me through that because, like, after Ida, once things calmed down a little bit, like, I called him up because I'd gotten word out to him and several family members as soon as I could to let everybody know we were okay.
Good.
But, like, after things settled down, I called him and I was really upset about the fact that, like, we hadn't made the call to leave. And he was like, dude, like, I looked at the storm track, you looked at the storm track, you made the decision you made with the information you had.
Right.
And it wasn't the best call, but you didn't know that until literally it was like 3 hours from landfall and the storm track shifted. And at that point, it's not like it moved a little bit. I mean,
it moved quite a huge degree. If it was going to go from, I'm not exactly sure where you guys live. I've heard the town mentioned, but I know Baton Rouge is a ways away from you.
I am straight north from New Orleans.
Okay, so Baton Rouge is a considerable distance.
Baton Rouge is the best part of like 60, 70 miles.
Right.
And given the fact that like,
that's a very big distance.
Yeah. Well, the storm, instead of going west of Baton Rouge, which would have given us a pretty light glancing blow, the eye of the storm literally went over my parents' house, and they're about 20 miles from me.
Right. So, you made the best choice you could with the knowledge you had at the time, and you can do nothing wrong and still lose sometimes.
Yeah.
You could be driving to work one day, obeying all the traffic laws, and a drunk driver T-bones you.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing you can do. Should you have called in sick to work that day? I guess. How would you have known? It's just like Ida. Basically T-boned you. Blindsided you. What are you going to do?
Well, fortunately, we were over-prepared for what we thought we were going to get, which made us almost appropriately prepared for what we actually got. I mean, let's call it what it is. I mean, that I've argued this with people from outside this area who have sworn up and down that what the National Weather Service says is gospel, but I have it. I know for a fact that the local weather station that is 2.5 miles from here clocked 135-mile-an-hour wind gust when that storm is passing by us. So
It's a
that's
lot.
firmly Cat 3, even though they say it was down to a Cat 2, almost, it was down to a weak Cat 2 by the time it got up here. But, like, that's,
Localized, it was worse.
yeah. Well, but that's also the weird part of this hurricane is that, normally hurricanes lose strength as they come inland, and this one didn't. This
Mhm.
one was still a roaring Cat 3 by the time it got all the way up here, and that's out of the ordinary.
It is. But you know, that kind of does go to emphasize why localized militias, localized response is key in any disaster situation. Doesn't matter what it is. Your neighbors are going to be the first people there on scene. And for some of your neighbors, I know you said you did give some supplies to some of your neighbors, you were the emergency response. Because how else could anyone get there at the time?
Yeah. Kind of a sobering thought that all these people had to rely on the crazy conspiracy theorists at the end of the street for survival.
Well, you know, if you got no food, if you got no water, does it really matter who gives it to you? No, not really. Not at the end of the day. Except for the strings that may be attached to it. And with the federal government, the strings are taxes. With you and your family, the strings are continued goodwill among neighbors. That's really what it is. I mean, you know, your neighbors, especially the ones that you helped, are incentivized from now on. If we want to talk in the most cynical of terms, are incentivized to be kind and friendly to you because you were there for them when they needed you.
Yeah, I would
And
hope.
that's really what the local militias were back in the day. It was you are incentivized to protect the local area because the local area is the only thing that's there to help you, largely because of travel restrictions. So, you know, as far as like the 1792 and then the further reforms of that act, a lot of that was the reason why it wasn't initially that the president could call everyone up all the time was because, well, how could they get there? You know, and really, it wasn't until they reformed it in 1903 and I think later 1908 that they extended the time periods beyond a few months.
Mm-hmm.
And let's be honest, how far could you travel in the early 1800s in a few months?
I mean, by train, but even that's only going to get you so far so fast.
Let's talk a battalion's marching speed, for instance.
Oh, Jesus.
You know, 10 miles a day would be you know, reachable. Some of them were capable of doing 20 miles a day. I mean, one of the forced marches for Gettysburg was 27 miles in a day. And that was considered a strenuous march.
It's also worth pointing out at this juncture, before we get into the Militia Act of 1903, is that, like, me having had some experience with military convoys, like, the first rule is you can't outrun your slowest element.
Exactly.
Which, interesting side note, this is the joys of the National Guard getting the hand-me-downs from the Army. When we deployed to Iraq in 2004, we still had deuce and a halves.
Nice. My grandfather drove a deuce and a half in the 80s.
So did I in the 2000s. So, yeah, we had deuce and a halves, which even with the tall tires, the on-road tires, the
questionable modifications.
Yeah, our motor pool might have done a little bit of backwoods hackery to make them a little bit faster, but they were still pretty well at 70 miles an hour. The valves were tap dancing on the hood. I mean, those things, they're geared really low, and even with the taller tires, they were not going to keep up with the Hemmets and the 5 tons and the Humvees if they all went flat out.
You know, my grandfather likes to claim that he was driving 100 miles an hour through the mountains in Germany in a deuce and a half, and I don't buy that. Was he outpacing his CO's Jeep? Probably.
Downhill with the clutch down on the floor? Maybe. Mm-hmm. Possibly.
Maybe.
But, yeah, I'm pretty sure if you ever got a deuce and a half up to 100 miles an hour, it'd be like Back to the Future, and you would just shoot through a time warp, because that's how they feel at 70 miles an hour. You feel you're about to take off.
I'm sure it felt like it was going 100 miles an hour. especially with a load of explosives in the back. Because if you crash, we're done here.
Yeah. But anyway, the Militia Act of 1903. So this is, I know there were several revisions to the Militia Act of 1792 in between then and this. This, I think, is like the most transformative change to the Militia Act, because this is where we see this concept of the National Guard finally birthed.
Yeah, the official birth of the National Guard.
Yeah. So also referred to as the Dick Act, the 1903 Dick Act designated the militia as two classes: the reserve militia, which included all able-bodied men at 17 to 45, and the organized militia. Now, in this context, the organized militia is what we know today as the National Guard. They are able to be called to, I believe it's Title 10 orders by the federal government. You're allowed to deploy them. The federal government can provide material aid and training dollars and equipment dollars to them. So that is a gross distinction between that and the previous iterations of the militia, which were totally up to the state. Even though in this, at least, I know that every National Guard's a little bit different. I know that in the state of Louisiana, the state still provides a lot of the financial support for the
vast
National
majority.
Guard. Yeah, which
until you deploy.
Until you deploy, which I think that mix of like federal versus state dollars, in my experience talking to other National Guards around the country, it seems like in the localities where the state is going to use that National Guard fairly often, like think places where we have floods, hi-oh, or hurricanes, or we have like wildfires out west. Areas like that where the National Guard is going to be pressed in service fairly often for state release, I find that the state tends to support more of the budget. Yes. I don't know if that's by design or if that just is the way it seems, but that's the way it seems.
Probably a little bit by design and a little bit by necessity. I know where I'm from in Illinois, the state provides, I would say, a substantial contribution, but I don't believe it's the majority contribution. And they really don't ever use them. Even in Chicago, when we had a lot of the riots that were going on during the Summer of Love, as they like to call it, they never called out the National Guard. The city of Chicago has a quite expansive, if dwindling, police force that they called out to witness what was going on.
That sounds useful.
Well, they made their choices, suffice it to say. You are correct. It is Title 10. They definitely gave some funding in this to modernize the National Guard units, which obviously that funding has bloated and increased as time went on with continued modernization. Because honestly, if you'd left it alone since 1902, you'd be talking bolt action Springfields, Springfield 1903s and whatnot. Obviously, the National Guard now has Humvees and 240 Bravos. So they've continued to funnel those things down. Whether or not they're secondhand or brand new probably depends more on the state than any federal grant.
Since you brought it up, when I was I got reassigned. I wasn't a saw gunner when we went to Iraq, but I was slotted as a saw gunner before we went to Iraq. Because
nice.
prior to 2004, like there was some chatter about us possibly having to go do a stint in Korea for some reason. Ended up not happening. We wound up in Iraq instead, which I don't know if that's an upgrade or a downgrade, but call it a change of locale.
Korea's more humid, Iraq's more dry.
Yeah. But when I was slotted as a saw gunner, I had an FN Mini-Me.
Oh.
Not the modernized, updated saw they were given to active duty. No, a full-blown, no bullcrap, legit FN Mini-Me.
Those things jam more than they fire, don't they?
Yes, I affectionately refer to her as things I'd rather not say on this podcast because it's family friendly. But let's just say that I have unleashed a 20-year-old Army vet's language upon that particular cursed weapon numerous times. Because all you had to do to get it to jam was just pull the trigger and wait. Right. And it was going to eat itself.
And runaways were extremely common with that generation too, weren't they?
I never had a runaway. That would have been fun. Because when you have a runaway,
use those.
When you have a runaway, which for anybody not familiar, a runaway is when a full auto weapon doesn't stop shooting when you take your finger off the trigger. It runs away. And you pretty much have two options at that point. Either you break the belt or you ride the lightning. I never got the opportunity to do either because mine had the opposite problem where I couldn't make it shoot. If it would have shot and not stopped, that would have been a different problem that I don't think I would have minded as much.
My one of my firearms instructors local to this area here is a retired Marine, and according to him, riding the lightning was the preferred option, especially when engaged in hostile activities.
Oh yeah, dump the mag, run the belt. Don't
Right.
you dare stop it. It's doing what it's supposed to right now.
Run the belt, roll behind whatever you can, and swap the barrel because that barrel is gone.
Oh yeah, that barrel is going to be smoothbore when this exercise is over.
Yeah. I don't think he was a saw gunner, but I know he had experienced
Probably an old M60.
probably
were
probably an old M60, judging by his age.
Yeah, well, I mean, hell, we had M60s when we went to Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
They were still in the military's inventory. I mean, they were for door guns for Blackhawks, but still.
Sure. Yeah,
like,
it's a viable weapons platform.
Oh yeah, just make damn good sure that the grip assembly doesn't fall off.
Well, I guess on the door gun, that's not the worst thing that could happen.
No, it's not.
I guess it could fall out of the helicopter.
Yeah, but then the mechanics would have to explain how that happened. So no, let's let something happen that's going to be the armorer's problem.
There you go. You sent me a link here to that Militia Act of 1903, and I'm just perusing it as we're talking here, and the biggest update to it, speaking of the National Guard, was the National Defense Act of 1916, where it actually enabled mobilization as we see it today. And so how you got mobilized, changed Title 10 a little bit so that instead of mobilizing them for 9 months, you could now mobilize for up to 2 years. That's a huge change. Unfortunately, our guys don't typically get mobilized for that long, but this was in the timeline of just before World War One. So quite clearly, World War One is going on, or at least in the very early stages of going on when this was changed. This, I think, was changed knowing we were going to have to deploy.
I mean, the writing was certainly on the wall.
Yeah. Fortunately or unfortunately, it was utilized heavily very shortly after its passage.
All right, now, Joe, your question is around count or cyclic rate. It's both. Because as a barrel gets hot, its tolerance for your tomfoolery diminishes a bit. So when you have like 100 or 200 round belt and the gun just goes, full kill, by the time you're going to reach a certain point where like you could shoot all 200 of those rounds with some breaks in between, it'd be fine. But 200 rounds all at once overheats the barrel, screws up the metallurgy. Nick probably knows more about metallurgy than I do. Yep. I just know that when you get a barrel hot enough, it doesn't appreciate it very much. And if you continue to shoot it, it'll let you know about it.
Yeah, so as the temperature of any metal increases, the tolerance for both friction, pressure, and let's say abuse generally in any aspect decreases. Some metals are fine with very high heat. A modern chrome moly barrel, you can get up to several hundred degrees before you start seeing negative repercussions. But, contrary to the memes, jet fuel can't melt steel beams. Okay, it doesn't have to melt it. At 500 degrees Fahrenheit, you have a noticeable decrease in what's called yield strength for most alloys. At 1,000 degrees, almost every alloy has a noticeable decrease in yield strength. Yield strength is what you're relying on when a firearm sends a bullet down the barrel. And you're talking about pressures anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000 psi, depending on some of these crazy wildcat rounds.
And according to the DoD with the new SIG Spear, this 6.8 millimeter, that's I believe was 80,000 psi chamber.
Not surprising. And you really only have to increase the temperature of a barrel to 500 to 600 degrees to the point where you're burning off some of the coatings that they're applying to those barrels. I don't know about you guys, but I've run some pretty aggressive 3-gun classes and some pretty aggressive carbine classes. My barrel was black when I bought it. My barrel is now a weird tinge of gray. I burned the black oxide layer off of my barrel. Now, that's perfectly fine. And mag dumps are not bad. Chrome moly barrels do help. Modern metallurgy helps a ton. Do not mag dump like your granddad's Luger. Don't do that. It's probably not going to destroy it, but it will strip the rifling out. Yes. Chrome moly barrels, super helpful. Mag dumps, in moderation. You can probably, I'm sure you can find, IraqVet 8888 has done videos on this all over the place.
Burn down the AR, burn down the AK.
Burn down the AK, burn down the Glock, and they're getting into thousands of rounds before these things are detonating. In a modern semi-automatic firearm, your gas tube is going to fail first.
Yep.
But you may still have done irreparable damage to your barrel. Now, how many of us are going to be in a situation ever in our lives where we're going to be mag dumping 1,000 rounds? I hope not. I don't want to be in that room. I really don't. Can you do it? Probably once. Probably once.
Yeah. Although I would offer that, like, from a training, longevity, the firearm perspective, like, if the barrel is getting so hot that it's uncomfortable to hold on to the handguard barehanded, you probably need to slow down a little bit. And this isn't like FUD lore one shot every second nonsense.
No, you're
but
right.
because I mean, and it sounds dumb, but I run into that problem out here in South Louisiana. If you go to the gun range when it's 90 or 95 degrees outside, you don't have to shoot an AR very long before there's enough heat radiating off the barrel. It's a little uncomfortable to hold that handguard.
So,
I mean, quit swinging your purse at man hands, I understand, but just saying.
You've got two things working for you there. So a lot of times your modern aluminum rails are free floated. Okay. So you're only connected to the barrel at the chamber, which is great. Aluminum also picks up heat and dissipates heat a lot faster than steel does. The coefficient for that is much higher. Copper, even higher. Silver and gold, even higher yet. The
Pro tip, anything that conducts electricity usually conducts heat very well too.
Absolutely does.
There's chemical reasons for that, but just, it's an interesting little footnote.
Yeah, energy transfer in general is really what you're looking at there. One thing you're going to get in your aluminum handguards is you're going to get that heating up hotter sooner than the barrel because you are at the chamber where the explosion is occurring. And it's picking up that heat out of the barrel and actually acting as a heat sink for you a little bit. So I would be very surprised if your aluminum handguard was warmer than your barrel, but it's probably comparable. And you got to remember, temperatures that are uncomfortable for humans start at anything over 100 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll notice something is warm when it's at body temperature. I think burns start in like the low 150s. I think. Let me look that up. I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, you can get a burn on your skin as low as 110 Fahrenheit. So that would be like just quick touch your car door that was really hot and you felt pain from it.
Boiling water.
Yeah, boiling water, 200-ish.
Easily.
Yeah. You're probably not getting your gun that hot unless you're getting blisters off of your handguard.
No.
Which, for modern steels, a couple 100 degrees, not really a problem. Oh, a 50-round drum on 308, that would get pretty warm.
That would make a lot of noise, too.
Especially if you throw a land tack on the end.
Jesus. So the one other thing I wanted to get into about the Dick Act before we move on is that we still have this we still have this age range of 17 to 45, which is pretty commonly accepted to be fighting age males. I mean, yeah, I guess we could have that debate, but that's the commonly accepted range. But this also made the distinction that there's now two classes of the militia, one of which is the National Guard, and the other one is all fighting age males 17 to 45. So, like, this is why the Militia Act, I keep bringing it up every couple of years, it seems, and I keep throwing it in people's faces whenever they talk about how the Second Amendment only applies to the militia, because I'm like, but if you look back through the history of what the militia is and the way that we have legislatively marshaled the militia still includes everybody. I mean, if you're old enough to
exists.
yeah, well, yeah. Ask me how I feel about the draft. And...
Well, I'm sure we feel about the same about it. But you know, if we're going to say that I, the 33-year-old machinist, am not a member of the militia, then why am I eligible for the draft?
Reasons.
Reasons indeed.
So yeah, if you don't mind, do you want to talk about like your experience with your local militia, or do
Sure.
you want to get into some of these? I guess we'll save the states misbehaving legislatively for last.
Sure. I'm not going to name drop the group I was associated with because there's a lot of people that I can't speak for that are part of the group. Suffice it to say that pretty much every state has a local patriot group, a local militia. A lot of them are definitely interfered with by feds. And it's my personal belief, I don't have any proof of this, that ours was also being interfered with by the federal government. There were some guys that would show up that were oddly well equipped and very fond of khaki pants.
Khaki pants, Ray-Bans, and Daniel Defense rifles.
Yeah. Daniel Defense rifles, oddly military long-range rifles. You know, things that weren't clones, that were clearly the real deal. Nobody showed up with full autos or anything like that. And, you know, it was a group of about 70 people that I was involved in, and this is in Illinois, so not exactly the most militia-y state. Everybody's heard of Michigan militia. But it was organized fairly similarly. Essentially what it was, there was a group of 10 or 15 military veterans that were the core of this group that formed what they held as mainly the officer class. I was also part of the officer class in the militia simply because of my studying of military history and my expertise with firearms. I do a lot of 3-gun shooting. I do a lot of competitive pistol and competitive carbine shooting. That's correct, Paul. Training never ends. And that's what we mostly did. Every weekend, we would meet up on Saturday or Sunday at a local farm. And what we would do is we would train. We had a uniform standard that was loosely employed. A lot of us did buy that kit because a lot of that kit was available at our local military surplus store, and the guy gave us a heck of a discount. Fantastic. A couple of our local FFLs, they also gave us discounts as long as we told them we were a member of the local militia. This militia is Illinois statewide. You could probably find it if you scroll through my social media. If you do, congratulations, you don't win anything. If you want to get in touch with them, they're excellent guys for the most part. One of the core leaders was a former paratrooper. He's the one that set the standards for the group. The standards were not you meet the standard or you're out. It was we are trying to bring everyone to this standard. That standard was a certain accuracy number. That standard was a certain mile run time. Rucking a mile in armor, and everyone was required to have armor, at least level 3. Most of us had level 4. Quite a lot of them had night vision. A lot of these guys spent a lot more money than I had and dedicated a lot more time than I could to readying themselves. I'm still in contact with them loosely, but I don't currently train with them simply due to the fact of distance at this point. There's a serious issue that you run into with any mutual assistance groups or militias, and that's the commitment level of the different members. And Phil, I'm sure you saw this in the National Guard, and I'm sure you saw this in the Army too. We had guys that they spent every extra dollar they had, every waking moment they could, training with those guys. Some of them were former military. Some of them had never served in their lives. Some of them probably would not be the best people to have armed. And I'm just going to be completely honest with you about that. There were some people there that probably should not have been armed. Paranoid, with a drinking problem. We tried our best to eliminate people like that and to encourage people like that to get help. We can only do so much. These guys had broken down to even at the MOS level, on a basic level. We had communications technicians. Some of these guys, two of these guys in particular, ran a company that did radios for the local police and fire departments. They took a RV, spray painted it up in, I guess you would call it multicam-ish, and then equipped it with every piece of radio technology that those guys could have access to. Now, we could not legally broadcast on the encrypted channels for police and fire, but we could listen. And they're still listening. They'd set up a ham radio repeater in there, as well as a few other radio technologies. They employed ham, CB, FMRS, GMRS, as well as some of the digital radio packet sending and receiving with your cell phone. Very brilliant tech guys. We had a retired chef that used to run a food truck that ran our support and logistics network that would make sure that we were all fed and watered. We had a water buffalo for carrying water to and from our FTXs. Some of the FTXs were hours, some of them were days. One a year was a week long. And we would roll out in a convoy with all of our firearms, ammunition, rations, food, and support equipment for a week. And then we would go down to a allied training facility, we'll call it, a guy that had a shooting range down in southern Illinois and a large campground attached to that shooting range. And we would do small infantry tactics drills for a week. Some of us would be up for 48 to 72 hours between pulling guard duty, doing patrols, doing shooting exercises. It was taken extremely seriously. We had retired Army snipers. We had retired Marines. We had, like I said, a paratrooper that was setting most of our standards. The biggest downfall always was and always will be, and this is true of the mutual defense groups too, commitment.
Mm-hmm.
Some guys were there once a month. Some guys were there every weekend. Some guys would disappear for 2 or 3 months. You wouldn't hear from them. They'd show back up. Now, this is, I think, a large part of the problem of why the National Guard was formed, was to formalize this training and formalize the commitment.
Well, and to also put teeth into reinforcing that commitment, because, like,
yes,
there were definitely differences in, I guess, internal commitment levels amongst National Guardsmen. Like, there were guys that just took it more seriously than others. But not showing up for drill enough times gets the local police on your back trails. So,
right, because that would be dereliction of duty, I believe, right?
Yeah. So it's one of those things where it's like, putting teeth into that kind of helps shore that up. But I can tell you from personal experience, like, the people who took their jobs deathly serious, you could reliably rely on them to do their job to the best of their ability.
Oh, yeah.
And the guys that did not care, we found things for them to do because we just didn't call it what it is.
For the militia group.
Yeah. Well, I mean, call it what it is. When you're turning wrenches on $8.5 million helicopter that's going to fly 4 of your buddies around, you kind of don't want the screw off who's not paying attention to what he's doing, turning the wrenches.
Absolutely.
Or safety wiring things.
If you want to talk like the tactics we trained to, some of our guys were as early retired as 6 months before they joined up with us. So some of our tactics, bit dated maybe, but we were training to modern building entry standards. We were training to modern infantry communications standards. Granted, we didn't all have encrypted radios, and we wouldn't be legally allowed to use them if we did. We largely used the FMRS bands, which everyone couldn't legally use for our short-range communications. But we had a barn with a built-out shoot room in it. We could move the walls around, and we had sandbags built up against the walls so that we could run fully hot and do entries. These groups exist in the continental US, and there might not be a lot of them, but I guarantee you there's one in every state. And most of them are run by pretty average guys. You know, the retired paratrooper that ran our group, I believe, was an insurance salesman at the time. Right, an insurance salesman.
There's a joke somewhere in there.
Is at a militia running a shoot house. Okay? Man, does that violate your homeowner's policy?
That would make for an interesting sales pitch, I imagine.
The safety aspect was taken extremely seriously. One of the nice things about the militia group was we had several paramedics, EMTA and EMTB, as well as an emergency room doctor and surgeon that was on call for us. He would come out, the surgeon specifically would come out when we did FTXs mostly, and he headquartered the medical division of it. We did have some guys that didn't drink enough water, got overheated. Thank God we never had any serious injuries. We never had any incidents with firearms that was a problem because all of us took that very seriously. You know, Trek, maybe he would want to come down on us for some of the live fire training exercises that we did in a stack. So entering a room in a stack of 3 to 5 guys and popping rounds off inside of a building. Maybe not the smartest, you know, in hindsight, given the level of training, but it was taken extremely seriously. And safety violations, you were ejected immediately. That's just how it went. You were immediately ejected. We were taught by people that were taught by the U.S. military, some of them Marines. I wouldn't say on par with the National Guard, but most of the guys also did 3-gun competitions and were excellent marksmen. The group of snipers that we had that were handpicked by a retired Army sniper were regularly training to 600 yards or beyond. We would do multi-day stalks through a guy's wooded property where we would have to, I never graduated his sniper course, if you want to call it a sniper course, but we would spend a day or two stalking through an observed woodlands or an observed prairie, moving up on a target and then taking a shot, which was extremely similar to the documentaries and all the literature I've read from the U.S. Army sniper programs.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this information is so out there and so available thanks to the global war on terror and the government's desire to propagandize us into joining the military that none of this stuff is a secret. Tactics, techniques, and procedures be damned. Whether or not they want to say that they're top secret or classified or a state secret, or it's all out there. And if we can find it, and if we can find a retired Army whatever, or a retired Air Force paratrooper, or a retired Marine Corps whoever to train us on it, or we can find the field manuals and train ourselves, what's to say our enemies can't?
And well, I think that's something I was about. Thing. That's something I was about to point out. Like, yeah, it's. I could see where it'd be very helpful for a burgeoning militia to find an experienced military veteran, if for no other reason than for the stuff that's not in the manual, like the experience, the battle-born experience,
or the battle-tested experience.
Yes,
because several of these guys bore scars from one of them from Fallujah. Can't say he hasn't used it.
But I guess what I was going to offer was like you could literally get an insurance salesman
Yep.
who wasn't an otherwise a retired paratrooper, but just an insurance salesman that had availed himself of the training and the techniques and committed the knowledge and spent the time training and just had the motivation. I mean, like to me, that is
I
the
never served.
truest, yeah, and that
I'm
is
a
the
perfect
truest spirit
example.
of the militia. Like to, I guess from my perspective, like all of us who are military veterans and every other veteran out there is welcome to disagree or shrug this off. It's just my personal feeling, but like I feel like we kind of have a responsibility to the degree we are able or motivated to maintain some level of our training and everything that we learn,
Absolutely.
if for no other reason the fact that, like, I make no bones about it, if the boot heel hits that front door, my wife and daughter are going to hide and I'm going to have to go deal with the problem. Like, I have a responsibility as a husband and father to defend my family. I have a lesser duty to defend my neighbors. That's pretty much on
True.
an as needed basis to what degree I feel like I'm willing to stick my neck out for
And
them.
it,
Bearing in
an
mind,
as liked basis.
yes, bearing in mind that absolutely none of them are going to come rushing to my aid with with an AR and an attitude problem.
Well,
Like that will be a singularly Phil activity in that regard.
to be
But I
fair,
do
not everyone is psychologically capable of making that choice.
I will agree with that wholeheartedly. Like, I don't even know if it's psychological. I'd categorize that more as emotional. But like,
But yeah, I mean,
this is
emotional is part of your psychology. I'm sure. I'm sure the local, I guess he's a therapist, would agree with that. Probably,
mm,
emotional and psychological, and I am not qualified to serve in the military. I'll put that out there. I have asthma. I'm an asthmatic. Okay. When I was 18 and I attempted to join the military, I was denied. Rightly so. You do not want an asthmatic sprinting 400 yards across the desert to try and engage in whatever they have to engage in. I'm not qualified for that, probably. There are people that are more physically qualified for that, and I understand that. But put me behind my bolt gun, that's a different story. Any of you that are in the Patreon chat have heard me refer to what I call my 300 vibe check round. It's an M2 AP pull thrown over 300 Win Mag powder charge. She's screaming, and she's screaming to a quarter MOA out of my Weatherby. Granted, I've gotten over my asthma as I got older, as my allergies have improved. Every 7 years, you're a new self, I guess, is what they claim. At the time, the military was right to deny me service. Fair enough. Don't hold it against them. I still had a passion for firearms and the use of firearms, so I took a lot of training classes. Before I ever got in contact with a militia group, I was shooting, I'd say, reasonably well in pistol and carbine courses. Not so great with a shotgun. I've gotten better since then. But I can shoot at or above most military standards. A SEAL's going to smoke me any day of the week, probably. They've got more time and they've got more budget. But my AR, inside of 300 yards, I'm pulling headshots on pop-ups. Not a problem. My pistol, inside of 35 yards, I'm pulling headshots on pop-ups. And that's the computer randomized pop-up silhouettes. So I'm okay. I have been beaten by a 12-year-old on an IPSC line. This girl, man, she is going to be in the Olympics in a couple of years. Her dad is the leader of the local IPSC club. She's going to the Olympics. But you want to talk about embarrassing. 32-year-old getting smoked. At the time I was 32, getting smoked by a 12-year-old shooting a 45 and I'm shooting a 9. Oh, man.
Before we move on to this last little topic, I will push back against that because, like, when my daughter's 11, she first started like shooting BB guns, either 7 or 8, and I moved her into a 22 at age 10. Because, like, we live in the suburbs, so it's not like I can take her around the backyard and we can pop targets with a 22. Like,
Right.
that involves waking her up at 7:30 in the morning, which I don't know if any of y'all out there have preteen girls, but that is a task all by itself. But like that involves getting her up at 7:30 in the morning, getting her something to eat, something to drink, improving her mood slightly, get her in the truck, driving 40 minutes to go to the gun range, and then just hope to God somewhere in that transitionary period she's found her good humor, because if not, it's a really short angry day.
Right.
But like she at 11 shoots better than most of the adults that are on that range next to her. Like she doesn't have the confidence yet, and I try my best to keep her like we shoot at the 22 range.
She doesn't have bad habits either.
Yeah. Well, and that's the funny part of it is like I'm the one who taught her how to shoot rifles. And admittedly, I'm a bit of a form critic. Like, I understand there's more than one way to skin a cat, but like I'm very particular with her about making sure that she's in the correct stance, that she has her, the buttstock in the shoulder pocket, make sure that, yeah, exactly. Like not letting her kick her elbows out, make sure that she really torques her shoulders so that her forearms are as straight up and down as possible. Like, and I really impress upon her a lot of that. And probably the best thing I ever did was I put a friggin' snap cap in the chamber of that rifle, and I sat her down here in my office, and I took my Manus X and I zip tied it to the barrel.
Perfect.
Didn't cost me a single round. It did cost me the snap cap, because that aluminum snap cap and that 22, it beat the friggin' the back of that rim so hard so many times that like the snap cap won't chamber anymore. It's just
absolutely. Rim fires are notorious for chamber damage if you dry fire without a snap cap.
Yeah, but the snap cap it will become an expendable part eventually.
Right.
But
Paul makes a very good point here. His comment on not everyone's ready to pull a trigger on looking at somebody through a scope. He's absolutely correct.
Mm-hmm.
I've never been in combat. I have no idea how I would react. I only know how I've trained. Paul, that's very fair critique. I have no idea what I would do. I know what I think I would do. And I believe that if you look at the statistics on that, Paul, look at the, I can't remember what the name of the study was. There was a study done after World War II that determined that only like 25 or 30% of people fired a shot in anger actually to kill. And then the U.S. military decided to do a bit of an experiment. They went to humanoid silhouette targets. And then in Vietnam, that number went up to like 50%-ish that were willing to shoot at humanoid torso targets. Then they went to photorealistic targets. And in GWOT, and Global War on Terror, and Phil, you may have had some of this training yourself, they started doing reactionary training.
Yep.
And that's the kind of training that I've been taking part in, where it's what looks like a person pops up. And that picture of a person is holding a gun. And you are training yourself to see person, hands, gun, fire.
Yep. I mean, it's absolutely desensitizing you to violence, but I mean, call it what it is.
Desensitizing you to violence.
That's what military training is, because most moral, rational, normal people have this internal wiring that prevents them from doing harm to their fellow man, except in extreme circumstances. And
unless you're a sociopath.
I did preface all that by saying normal, rational. But unfortunately, like part of military services, you have to be prepared to drop the hammer on somebody.
You need to desensitize the recruits. And they have figured out an excellent way of doing that. And that is photorealistic, fast-moving targets, where you have to make that decision in under, say, a second and a half, 2 seconds.
They're doing it a lot with law enforcement these days too.
Yes.
Because they are more likely to be in a situation where you have non-combatants running around in the middle of the hot zone.
Exactly.
Although, I mean, I say that at the same time, like you look at some of the engagements we had in Iraq and not so much Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a really weird war, but like mostly Iraq, especially.
Afghanistan's a weird place.
Yeah, but I mean, it's kind of like Vietnam with mountains and no forests.
Yes.
in terms of like the distance and the time from one engagement to the other, very often would be much longer. Whereas Iraq, like once you get into a
It's
city,
constant.
it's block by block by block. Woman with child runs across, like right across the battlefield in the middle of all the shooting. God be with them if they don't get hit.
Iraq
It's
was the absolute worst kind of battlefield for any soldier in modern history, as far as I'm
yeah.
concerned.
Yeah, well, I mean, not having had to live it boots on the ground in combat, because thank God I wasn't infantry. But I mean, combat convoys, I have this memory that sticks out to me while we were convoying. We were driving through Baghdad, and we're on a 2-lane highway. So imagine yourself, you're driving to work, and you're on a 2-lane highway, right? And like we know that there's an exit we have to take in the next however long, and we're in the left lane, so we have to get in the right lane. We have to take the exit, and
The
there
enemy
is
knows you have to take the right lane.
don't beat me to the punchline. So the whole chalk of this line of vehicles, I think there was 13 of us. We all start meandering into the right lane, and I have a crappy little 80 something Toyota Corolla in the lane next to me. I'm the truck commander. I'm the guy in the right seat with a rifle and a radio, and I'm responsible for making sure these 3 men with me don't die today.
Right.
And my driver cannot come over because there's a crappy little 80s Toyota Corolla in the lane next to us, and he thinks it is hilarious based on his giggling and him and his buddies pointing at us and shooting us the bird and everything else. He thinks it is hilarious that we cannot merge over because he's in our path.
Right.
So I tell my driver, speed up. He speeds up, the Corolla speeds up. He slows down, the Corolla slows down. Like, you can see where this is going. And we are approaching the exit. And the whole serial is in the right lane, and we need to be in the right lane because the last thing I'm about to do is end up like those poor SOBs in another National Guard unit that got separated from the rest of their convoy and wound up in the middle of friggin' Baghdad, lost, pinned in.
Yeah, that is unacceptable.
Yeah, 0% chance of that happening. So, I told my driver, count to 3. I told my driver, count to 3, blow the horn, yank the wheel hard right, and then I yelled at the two gunners, one with an M240 or one with an a SAW and one with a Mark 19 that were in the bed of the Humvee. I yelled at both of them, point at the friggin' vehicle to your right, rack your weapons, get ready to go hide.
Right.
So so at that moment, both of these guys swing their weapons over towards the Corolla. My driver blows the horn and starts yanking the wheel. The Corolla hits the friggin' dirt at 65 miles an hour to get out of our path.
Right, because that was just a guy that was not happy with you being there.
And on the one hand, I don't fault him because, I mean,
right.
call it what it is. If it had been a car bomb, he'd have just detonated and we'd have all seen Jesus
absolutely.
that day. But it was one of those situations where it's like, okay, like, define for me what a weird situation this is in, where I am in a Humvee in body armor with a full auto M16,
and this guy's brake checking you.
Yeah,
essentially.
And I have literal civilians that I don't have permission to shoot at because of the rules of engagement. I don't really have a moral.
Rightly so.
I don't really have a moral dog in this fight to just light them up for no reason. But we also know from all the sit reps and the intelligence reports that could have very easily been somebody who was in league with one of the local insurgent groups who was literally calling to tell them, hey, we got this Humvee over here. We're going to shave him off for the rest of his cereal and point him towards y'all.
Right.
Because it happened.
Or delaying the entire convoy until an ambush can be in place.
Exactly. So I mean, it's when, and like that is hardly a unique story on my behalf. Like, talk to any friggin' Iraq vet and that spent any amount of time convoying or kicking doors or doing really anything, and I'm sure you'll hear stories about how, like, they were put in situations by the local civilian population that were almost designed to cause them to screw up.
And I can't. That's actually a great tactic for an insurgent group. If you have a couple of martyrs that maybe they're not capable of doing, say, a live 1-to-1 firefight with U.S. troops, get them to kill some innocent civilians.
I have made that assertion on more than one occasion, because like what ISIS was really good about, even before they were known as ISIS, when it was just the insurgency, they were really good about recruiting. Because all you need all you need is one soldier to kick the wrong door
Right.
and wake up a family in the middle of the night who were not terrorists, and the insurgents would be on their door the next frickin' night,
You,
recruiting every man in the house that can carry a rifle for the cause. So I used to tell everybody, I'm like, and this by the way works in the inverse too. Like
mhm.
if you are on the bottom end of the asymmetrical warfare,
Right.
like this it works. This is mutual fire as far as I'm concerned.
Oh,
Like
absolutely.
you're in the situation where if you accidentally burn down the wrong person, you just created five new problems for you to deal with. I mean,
You did.
hell, you could argue you could argue that when we supply the mujahideen in Afghanistan with arms so they could kick the Russians out, and we weren't there to frickin' like help rebuild hospitals and schools and everything else. We had an entire generation of young men grow up without fathers, angry because the United States promised them aid and weren't there.
And you think they don't remember?
And
Everybody
you and
remembers.
you think we weren't fighting those exact same people in the 2000s in
Oh, I
Afghanistan?
guarantee we were. Osama bin Laden was one of the people we armed.
Yeah.
It's the U.S. has a really terrible history of arming people and then walking away and seeing how it sorts out.
Or doing like we're doing in Ukraine right now and just flooding the zone with frickin' arms that there's no accountability for. And those weapons are turning up in Mexico in the hands of the cartels, but that's none of my daggum business, I suppose.
If any of you guys are going to Vegas anytime soon, I'm sure there is a betting pool on how soon one of those will be used on U.S. citizens.
Probably
Odds
is.
probably aren't great as far as betting against it. Pretty good odds it's going to happen eventually. I mean, look at the weapons the Obama administration sold to the cartels.
Mm-hmm.
Fast and the Furious. They killed a border patrol agent before the operation was even done.
Yep. And
You,
exactly zero
and let's
people have
be
gone to
honest.
prison.
Hey, I understand that there are different takes on the Ukraine situation, and we're not here to get into that right now. But
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine was listed as one of the most corrupt countries in the world as soon ago as the day it was invaded. It's probably not changed too much in the time being. Granted, like I get it. They don't have time to do corruption investigations in the middle of a foreign invasion. Understandable. But that means that government that was the most corrupt on the day of the invasion is the government that is one of the most corrupt in the world today.
And now they're funded by the U.S. taxpayer.
Lockheed Martin sending them their best.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, that like Andrew and I have talked about the war in Ukraine. I'm pretty sure on this show. If not, we've done it privately. And as I am with most things, I'm a little conflicted.
I think as you
Like
should be.
yeah. Well, like you said earlier about you kind of outing yourself as a small L libertarian. Like I tell
Mm-hmm.
everybody, I'm like libertarian to me is not a binary choice. It's a spectrum. Like
Exactly. Like most political opinions, it's a
yeah,
spectrum.
yeah. Government is a necessary evil. Government is like fire. When fire's in your
Yes,
fireplace, it does something useful. When fire gets out of the fireplace, you have a problem to deal with.
exactly.
When
There,
government is in its place doing its job, it can do something useful. And when government starts going places it's not supposed to, doing things it's not supposed to, your house burns to the ground.
for instance, the new law that was passed in was it Virginia?
Virginia and Vermont, and those are
Virginia and
probably not the only
Vermont.
ones.
Yeah, there's at least two that I'm aware of. There's some pretty interesting implications to that. For instance, driving instructors. I brought up before we got on here. I don't know if you guys have read the law here, you guys in the audience, but to do a brief quote here, Phil, if you don't mind me doing so.
Go for it.
Essentially, the law in Virginia is basically the same as Vermont. So I'm gonna quote Virginia's because I have the code brought up here. A person is guilty of unlawful paramilitary activity, punishable as a class whatever felony. Teaches or demonstrates to any person the use, application, or making of any firearm, so any gunsmithing school, explosive, incendiary device, or technique, and that's the key here, capable of causing injury or death to persons. Okay? It also states that if you assemble with one or more persons for the purpose or intent of training with, practicing with, or being instructed in the use of yada, 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 or technique capable of causing injury or death to persons intending to employ or knowing that they could have intended to employ this in the furtherance of civil disorder. That's the key definition here. That's the problem. The techniques in the furtherance of civil disorder. What's civil disorder? I think that's a pretty key here. Civil disorder is any public disturbance involving acts of violence by assemblages of 3 or more persons which cause an immediate danger of or results in damage or injury to property or persons of any individual. So if 3 families are carpooling in a car and they've all gone to the same driver's ed facility, and one of them makes an illegal lane change and that causes destruction of personal property, by this definition, the person who trained them to drive is guilty of running a paramilitary training facility because the military teaches driving.
And see, this is the part of this whole, like, to kind of tie all this together with a bow. Like, this is the part that drives me the craziest, because we still have the Militia Act of 1903 sitting on the books.
Mm-hmm.
And the Militia Act of 1903 makes pretty plain if you're between 17 and 45, and I would argue much older than that, but 17 and 45 is what the law decrees.
At the bare minimum.
Yeah. Then you are a member of the unorganized militia.
Right. The reserve militia at the very least.
Yeah. So you have a legislated, legal obligation to be able to perform in the capacity of your local militia.
And where I would argue that that is also including physical fitness.
I would argue that that's not an unfair discussion to be had. It gets into that whole level of commitment thing where it's like,
right.
You know, like, to what do you need to be as fit as a Navy SEAL? Do you need to do you need to not have asthma, for example? But to me, it's like with the likelihood of your engagement should come your level of commitment to the fitness.
Right.
Same
Absolutely.
thing, because call it what it is. Every working stiff out there has 1,000 things to worry about before they worry about getting into Navy SEAL shape and being able to shoot ticks off a dog's butt. Like, we all have mortgages and jobs, and most of us have wives, significant others, kids, hobbies, friends, family, whatever.
Or at the very least, a very hungry dog.
Yes. So at the end of the day, like, I totally understand that person that says, I don't need to be able to knock out a 5-minute mile.
Oh, agreed. A 5-minute mile is a bit of an extreme,
but you should also not weigh 350 pounds and, like, you know,
right.
eat Twinkies like Tic Tacs.
Now, medical conditions aside, because let's be honest here, we're all born with our own trials and tribulations. For me, it was asthma. All right, fair enough. I got off easy. Let's be honest.
Me too,
here.
actually.
No, I did. I absolutely got off easy because as you get older, your allergies change, right? I had allergy-induced asthma when I was a teenager. So now that I'm, let's say by 22, I pretty much grew out of a lot of my allergies that were inducing my asthma. I used to be allergic to pine tree pollen, of all things. And if anybody's familiar with Illinois, if there's one thing we have a lot of, it's corn and pine trees. That's pretty much gone away. I can run pretty much as fast as I ever have. By the time I was out of college, by the time I dropped out of college, let's be honest here, I did drop out of college. By the time I dropped out, I was able to run a 6-minute mile. Where in high school, I was lucky for a 12-minute because of asthma attacks. Just because the allergies when you exercise definitely aggravate your asthma.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, I was able to bench press 250 pounds. Can't do that now. I don't have 4 hours a week to go to the gym, but I'm still in relatively good shape. I can run a mile in body armor. I've done it. The local PD don't really appreciate when you run in body armor. Thankfully, they make weighted exercise vests now. If anybody's wondering, that's great use for your level 3 steel armor that you bought 15 years ago. That's no longer great. Yeah, I'm in Illinois. Still there, Paul. Kind of stuck here right now due to the corporation and family. You know, I've got some aging family that we help out quite a bit with. Yeah, the local Illinois police don't appreciate you going for a jog in a plate carrier. Put it that way.
So yeah,
Especially,
that's hilarious because like there's an older gentleman that I'm about 98% convinced is either current or former military. Just when you've been around the military community long enough,
you
or
can see
you've
it
been,
coming.
you can kind of see him coming, and he gives off that vibe. But he and his wife both run the lakefront, not too far from where I
Right.
live. And I've told my wife, I'm like, I don't want to stare and I don't want to ask, but he's either wearing a weighted vest or a legit plate carrier with plates in it.
It's
And
probably a
I'm
plate
not,
carrier.
I mean, I wouldn't be totally shocked. And this is one of the reasons why one of the things on my list is to upgrade the plate carrier so that my old cheap, junky one can just turn into a weighted vest,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
reasons.
I have an old set of level 3 AR 500 armor that I run in because it's heavier than that I exercise in general in because it's heavier than my ceramic armor now. So
Well, on the upside, it helps to offset the fact that ceramic's lighter, but you'll be carrying ammo.
true, very true, especially especially if you're carrying like 308 or 30-06 or 300 Win Mag, and water. Water is heavy.
Yeah.
Um,
But yeah,
you talk about Virginia's law here and Vermont's law here. As you said before we started, it's effectively unenforceable because anything you teach someone that could cause destruction to property, and you teach them in a group of 3 or more, because it specifies in a group of 3 or more, welding students. What happens if a group of welding students decide to protest and weld the axles on police vehicles?
or weld steel plate to a bulldozer.
Or weld steel plate to a bulldozer? Or say your local firefighting school teaches you how to block a road, right? Got to block a road in case of an emergency. What happens if 3 of those students who, say, drop out of firefighting academy for whatever reason, maybe they don't like it, they're now protesters. Those protesters block a road. They block it using the techniques they were taught in the firefighting academy. The firefighting academy is now an illegal paramilitary training group.
High school chemistry class. I can't speak for the rest, y'all, but I learned some not.
There's body armor in Illinois. Paul, you can absolutely own body armor in Illinois. Trust me, I order it to my house semi-regularly. I just recently upgraded to ceramic level 4 armor. You can order it in Illinois. Illinois was attempting to ban body armor, but that did not go through in the last legislative session. We did unfortunately get a rather nasty assault weapons ban that's running through the courts right now. Yeah, essentially the modern. Yeah, Phil, I see the face. The assault weapon ban right now effectively might ban Remington 870 shotguns and 1022s because they can look like AR-15s. We're not quite sure.
Nobody is until somebody gets pinched for it.
Well, that's exactly the problem,
and I think, like, to my point, or I was talking about earlier, like I really feel like that's the intent of these laws, because like neither you nor I, nor Andrew, and I know that he's tapped Trek from MDFI up where he lives, and
right.
I'm getting this third hand through Andrew, but like no one I've talked to really legitimately thinks this has a prayer of standing up in court.
Oh no,
like,
but it doesn't have to. That's the point. You know, and even if it doesn't stand up in court long term, it's going to be a tack-on charge.
Yeah. Well, and even above and beyond just being a tack-on charge, like I truly believe that the intent of the propaganda around militia groups, and honestly, let's be fair, some of those militia groups brought it upon themselves by doing
they absolutely
very stupid things.
There's definitely been some very poor behavior. Even in the group I was in, there was some exceptionally poor behavior. Some guys made some very questionable choices on demonstrating with the badges on.
Yeah.
They're the patches.
But I guess like my feeling is like I feel like a lot of that is designed to cool the training aspect and cool this idea and honestly like make make the attempt of law-abiding citizens to prepare themselves for extraordinary situations either impossible or at least unpopular, which I view. I
Exactly.
mean that.
Or, as Paul pointed out, cost preventative.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Because
oh
I don't know about you guys, but I've got a business attorney and she runs 150 an hour and she's cheap and very good.
yes,
But
criminal defense attorneys, good criminal defense attorneys, they're worth their weight in gold,
oh,
quite
absolutely,
literally.
undoubtedly. Now
Especially,
this gal I'm
especially
working
when
with,
you're facing down federal gun charges
right,
and
and you're
like
not paying
30
for
to
just one lawyer at that rate. You're paying for the lawyer, the paralegal, their assistants for each of them, because trust me, they all have assistants. And you're also paying for any of the researchers that they contact. Say if they reach out to Trek for a civil defense case, I'm sure Trek has been called up as an expert witness in probably at least one case, I would imagine. I don't know if he's talked about that with you, but he gets a fee, and you're paying that fee too, plus interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but like I said, that's where I see a lot of these laws really being aimed. Is I think the attempt is being made legislatively to cool this dangerous
Mm-hmm.
subversive training. But like at the end of the day, I always come back to the idea that like again, being an originalist, a constitutionalist called me old fashioned, but like I truly believe that every homeowner, every person has a duty to defend themselves because no one's
Yes,
going to fight harder than you will to defend your own life. Period. End discussion.
undoubtedly.
Every parent has an obligation to defend their children. Every husband, every wife has an obligation to defend their spouse. Everyone has has some obligation, probably a lesser obligation than they would to their own family unit, to their community.
Yes.
Like the average person, I would like to think, even though like in modern times of social media, we all know that when somebody's getting the crap kicked out of them, everybody pulls out the cell phone to freaking Snapchat it
Well, to be
or
fair, that's
Instagram.
been legally incentivized.
Yes, it has.
And
It
it's
absolutely
actually
has been.
more recently, it's been legally disincentivized to film. I forget where it occurred. Lauder with Crowder covered this quite extensively. The guy that filmed that interaction between the suspected felony burglary suspect and he ended up catching a 12 gauge round to the chest when he tried to wrestle the gun away. Shoot, I can't remember what his name was. The guy that filmed that incident is doing life in prison.
For what?
For I believe material contributions. Let me see if I can find it. It wasn't Trayvon
Oh,
Martin.
oh, he had a hell of a bad lawyer.
No, he had a very good lawyer. But the problem was that I think they got him under conspiracy. They called him a conspirator, even though he didn't know the other perpetrators.
I don't know.
Man, I know it's going to come back to me as soon as we get off here.
In
I'm
any
sure one of
case,
the guys in the group, one of the guys watching here or in the group, the Patreon group, knows exactly who I'm talking about.
in any case, like
They
what I
found
was
the guy
go-
in a truck. Shoot.
what I was going towards was like you have a lesser obligation to defend your community and so
Yeah.
on and so forth, support the Constitution, and you know if you feel a patriotic obligation to defend your country because it is your home in some capacity, then you know fine. But I feel like to that end, like you have a duty to be able to actually do that, and that's why I think it's important to like tread back over this ground about talking about the concept of the militia and its implementation in our early American history, and then to look at some of the jackassery, frankly, that's going on right now and point out like this is antithetical to literally what was federal law 250 years ago, where you could get a felony for not having a rifle and ammo or a
Right.
musket and ammo. Like I think that's important to point out so that we can try to put into context people that don't really see militias in a positive light or see the need for them, but they can kind of look at it and say, okay, like this is where we started and this is where we're at now, and that is why there's some people that view paramilitary training as being something that should be encouraged, not discouraged. I mean, if for no other reason than the fact that if you have this many million people run around with AR-15s. God Almighty, I hope somebody would teach them how to use them.
Right. I did find that case. It was the Ahmaud Arbery case. William Bryan recorded on his cell phone the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, and he was sentenced to 35 years in prison. I was incorrect. It was not a life sentence. It's 35 years in prison for filming the convicted hate crime. So because he followed these men and filmed them doing this, he was convicted to 35 years in prison for contributing to a hate crime. So now we're not supposed to pull out our cell phones and document a crime, perhaps?
I kind of go back to the idea that the state is going to make whatever you did illegal retroactively so they can put you in prison.
Oh, yeah. As long as you're inconvenient to them.
That might be the libertarian in me speaking.
No, I think that's the realist in you speaking, because quite clearly the filming of this was inconvenient to them, or at least they suspected it may be inconvenient to them, so they charged him anyway as a co-conspirator, even though from what I know, he didn't know the people that followed Ahmaud Arbery. Now, we can talk about whether or not that was a correct conviction or not of the guys that did follow him and kill him. Fine, separate story. But you witnessed a crime occurring and you videotaped it. Maybe your Ring doorbell witnessed a crime occurring and you videotaped it. Do you deserve 35 years in prison? Did you conspire in that killing?
Well, I mean, obviously you put the Ring doorbell there, so that sounds like conspiracy to me. That sounds like intent.
Premeditated even. Yeah, you can argue these things to mean whatever you want. I'm clearly no lawyer, neither are you. That's fine. We don't have to be to understand what's going on here. And it seems to be that if you're inconvenient to the regime, you're a criminal. That's what we're coming to, quite clearly. I mean, cocaine found in the White House. Known cocaine addict, the president's son. Sorry, crack cocaine addict, the president's son. No idea where that cocaine came from. I mean, if you found some 9mm ammo in my house, known 9mm user, definitely not the person who was responsible for that 9mm ammo.
Yeah, that's like if somebody finds gunpowder laying around the garage, nobody has any earthly idea where that came from.
Clearly is not Phil's gunpowder. Couldn't possibly be Phil's gunpowder.
Clearly it didn't come out of my cabinet full of gunpowder, even though I am the only one in this house who knows how to reload ammo. Clearly not. That mystery will never be solved.
Definitely never be solved. Clearly a mystery for the ages.
Yeah.
I mean, it just brings us back to how unenforceable some of this stuff is, except if you're a known enemy of the state. And that, at this point, with this administration is, and this Justice Department, conservatives, or anybody that's not liberal enough. I hate to break it down to that point, but everybody that's getting tried is, at the very least, anti-Biden, anti-Democrat. I mean, I don't want to call this country what it's kind of looking like. It looks like a banana republic.
Kind of does, honestly.
I mean, when's the last time you've seen a modern first world country maliciously try to convict a political rival of the current ruling party?
That's common in communist states.
Oh, it's extremely common in communist states, sure. But I'm talking about, like, let's look at any Western democracy. Can you think of a time when any Western democracy has convicted of political opposition? I mean, it's been unthinkable for generations.
Not now.
There was some questionable things that went on during World War II, specifically in Britain. There was some questionable convictions that went on in Parliament. I'm not super into British history, but I have heard there were some political convictions that went on prior to World War II to keep the fascists out of British politics. We can argue whether that was morally correct or not, but
I mean, basically just their version of McCarthyism.
exactly. And so we're going back to McCarthyism. Was that a good idea?
Better men than me have debated that.
Right,
But,
exactly. Me too.
but we are going to have to roll this one out. I have
Sure.
dinner to eat and then my afternoon walk to go on.
Nice.
Because as you so eloquently pointed out, Thick Boy Prepper needs to lose a couple of pounds to get back into fighting shape.
Hey man, you will never regret fitness.
Oh, I regret it every night. I just appreciate a little. I just regret it a little less every night.
There you go.
But, well, Nick, I appreciate you coming on the show, man, talking to us. I can already see in your future you have to come on and regale us with
Sure.
3D printed gun talk because
We can do that.
It's outside of my wheelhouse, but it is firmly in my interest. Mostly because I'm just a garden variety dissident.
$300 to $500 in a couple months of your time, you could be knocking out Glock 19s every other day.
So call that a teaser. If y'all want me to Shanghai this guy back onto the show, just blow up our social media, leave his comments. Hell, half of y'all probably know how to get in touch with him better than I do.
Facebook, Patreon group.
Yep. Matter of Fact's podcast heading out the door. Good night, everybody.
Night.